Yeah, the stress is on smoothly. So first of all, good morning to all of you. So it's an enormous pleasure for me too to welcome all of you here in Freiburg as the co-host of this conference. When thinking of what to say on this occasion, I couldn't help but recall the, in my opinion, ingenious motto of the 2006 Football World Cup here in Germany, Die Welt zu Gast bei Freunden, literally something like the world visiting friends. I think at the time the original, the translation in English was something like a time to make friends, but this doesn't render at all, I think, the original German motto. But Die Welt zu Gast bei Freunden, the world visiting friends, this I believe is still a wonderful motto for an international conference like this one. It has several times been said, more than 300 participants from some 30 nations. It's only that in this case, I think we are at least one step ahead of this motto. Because for Christian and me, the implicit personal motto of IL1 has been all along friends visiting friends, or simply friends visiting. We have friends visiting from all over the world, and I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying that never before have I attended a conference with so many dear colleagues, true friends, and highly respected, internationally acclaimed people I've always wanted to meet. And my guess is that there may be quite a few more in this lecture hall this morning who share this feeling, which simply shows that it was a great idea and high time indeed for launching this society. As you can imagine, when you organize a conference in the spirit of its friends visiting, this is at the same time an enormous challenge, obligation, but also an enormous incentive. And what we, the whole organizational team, hope is to have created and to continue to create an atmosphere that shows you just how welcome all of you are, and that you will remember this first IL conference as one of utmost academic enrichment and personal well-being. Okay, this much for the implicit, somewhat personal motto of this conference. The official motto, the official title of this conference is The Linguistics of English, Setting the Agenda. Well, and looking at all the submitted abstracts and the papers and posters which eventually made it into the program, one topic clearly looms large at this conference. This is variation, okay? The study of varieties of English. So definitely varieties of English are a major part of this agenda of English linguistics in the 21st century. So just look, for example, I hope this works now, okay? Just look, for example, at the great number of workshops and theme sessions that actually put center stage to varieties. So we have 4 out of 11 workshops and 7 out of 21 theme sessions that deal and address various aspects of varieties of English. And thus it is not astonishing either that also half of our plenaries deal with varieties of English. And the first of these varieties plenaries will open this conference, and it's a truly personal pleasure and privilege for me to briefly introduce to you this morning's plenary speaker, Professor Rajend Mesthrie, who truly embodies the study of language variation in English. I think as of this year, Raj holds a research chair at the University of Cape Town, financed by the National Science Foundation, so there is even more that you can read by Raj in the future. He is one of the most prominent and active sociolinguists in the field and a leading expert on world English. His research is of interest to disciplines as distinct as language variation and change, contact linguistics, multilingualism, language acquisition and learning, language shift in migrant communities, etc. Raj has worked, among other things, on language contact, language shift, and a wide number of varieties spoken in South Africa, such as Black South African English or South African Indian English. He's held visiting professorships in numerous countries, for instance at the University of Regensburg in Germany. He is on the editorial board of a variety of international journals, including World Englishes, English Worldwide, and the Journal of Linguistics, Sociolinguistics. As of this year, he is one of the 3 new editors of English Today, I think together with Kingsley Bolton and David Graddle. He is author of several books on South African English and Hindi in South Africa, has co-authored an introduction to sociolinguistics, and most recently, together with Rakesh Bhatt, World Englishes, the study of new linguistic varieties, published by CUP this year. His research findings have been published in prominent peer-reviewed journals such as Anthropological Linguistics, Journal of Pidgin and Creole Linguistics, English Worldwide, etc. He has edited Languages in South Africa, published by CUP in 2002. He also edited the Concise Encyclopedia of Sociolinguistics, and he has also edited the regional volume on Africa and Southeast Asia of the Mouton de Gruyter Handbook of Varieties of English, published in paperback early this year. Raj will open this conference with a kind of progress report on an ongoing research project focusing on changing English norms in a deracializing South African society, the Sociophonetics of English in Post-Apartheid South Africa. The floor is all yours, Raj. Also, da ist eine Maus, habe ich gesehen.
Distinguished guests, our rector of Freiburg University, if he's still here, the committee of IEL and the organizing committee of Freiburg. I would like to say at the outset how very pleased I was to be invited to speak at this conference. And I am more than flattered to be asked to open such a distinguished conference. I can only endorse everything that Bernd has said about the wonderful range of scholars and scholarship that they have attracted to Freiburg for this opening conference of IEL. There are many people here who I also count as friends and colleagues, but also many people whose work I have long admired but have not had a chance to meet because trips from down south to up north can only be done sparingly. And for me personally, this is a bit of deja vu because only a year ago I recall speaking under not dissimilar circumstances at the University of Regensburg. And I know that some of you were there, and I must ask you to bear with me because my presentation and indeed my very opening jokes are going to be reruns of what I said at Regensburg, because what I said was sincere and true and hasn't changed. I count myself really lucky to have made amazing contacts in this country since about 2000, and it happened mostly by accident. I was approached by Mouton to join an august team of Edgar Schneider, Bernd Kortmann, and Kate Burridge, to be a co-editor of this massive volume of Varieties of English in the World. Little did I know when I accepted the invitation with sort of glowing eyes how much work would be involved. But I think very fondly of both Regensburg and Freiburg as kind of genesis sites for the project. We had long meetings over lots of wine, I seem to recall, in the evenings, in which we plotted and charted the way forward for the volume. So it's wonderful to be there. On a more personal note, I count myself very lucky in that the invitations I get from Germany seem to come from the right places, and I must be the only person in the world who has this absolutely wonderful image of Germany. It's a small country, very rustic, rural, beautiful, and all the places I know, whether they're big towns or small cities, are Heidelberg, Regensburg, and Freiburg. Okay. So the other repetition of small talk from Regensburg is I distinctly recall saying a year ago to a slightly different audience, although there was significant overlap, especially I think with younger scholars, of World English is kind of society that works in a slightly different tradition. And I recall saying how wonderful it was that the World English's conference circuit should come to Germany. And in a way, I depicted it as nothing but a kind of Germanic dialect coming home, okay, after a long stopover in Anglo-Saxon land across the ocean and many sojourns across the Atlantic, across the Pacific, across other oceans, and coming back to Europe, admittedly not as far south as Freiburg, but still close enough as far as I'm concerned. And it's a much changed language since it left, and I think this conference will be documenting some of the kinds of changes involved there. As for setting an agenda, I'm not very good at setting agendas, so I won't say much beyond, I think, a plurality of agendas is probably called for, and I'm very impressed by the core areas of the conference. I mean, it really is a kind of mouth-watering menu that we have in front of us, and I, for one, I'm going to be very hard-pressed to make the right choices as to which workshop and which sessions to attend. But I think in terms of setting the agenda, you've got it right. The program shows attention to the classics of historical linguistics, and it's only appropriate that they should be at the university that had, in addition to the fine scholars mentioned already, people like Hermann Paul and the neo-grammarian tradition. And in addition to historical linguistics, of course, more contemporary aspects, syntax, phonology, deeply immersed in corpus linguistics, in sociolinguistic variation, the study of learner varieties, and so on. So I think things are really dovetailing very well, and we shouldn't worry, in my opinion, too much about the agenda. It seems to be taking care of itself. Okay, my talk, as I've said, is a continuation of a talk I gave last year. It's the Sociophonetics of English in Post-Apartheid South Africa. For me, it marks a slight departure from my traditional research on language contact, and this time I'm kind of following what young people are doing, and it seems to me that sociophonetics is an exciting part of global English studies. And I've thought of two subtitles. One is called Chasing the Wild Goose, because this entire paper is about the goose vowel. But since goose is fronting, and since I'm here in Freiburg, I thought of another title this morning, something like The Return of Umlaut. Okay, this is a very quick outline just to orient you as to what I'll be doing. I'll be talking background shortly, and then I'll talk about middle-class social change in relation to South Africa and sociolinguistic theory, giving you the ethnography of 4 groups I have studied, and then look at goose fronting in terms of the different social groups in post-apartheid South Africa. Okay, let me then give some background as to what it is that interests me. South Africa is a country that has undergone tremendous changes since the 1990s, and it's a time when the world was changing globally. If you think of Eastern Europe, Russia, other places as well, a tremendous social change, new democracies coming to being with lots of new problems too, and one can choose to study the problems, and I have sort of worked on some of those aspects, although not as fervently as colleagues in applied linguistics, and there's a sense in which if the world has to be changed, then I'm counting on the applied linguists to do that. I want to chart out one of the success stories of post-apartheid South Africa, namely the kind of transition from a deeply divided racial society prior to the 1980s to a society in which there is a tremendous sense of new things happening and young people coming together. This is certainly one of the success stories, the kind of expansion of the educated middle classes in South Africa and the sense of non-racial social networks and friendship and love relations across color lines. Really, this is not just a particular case study of a particular country and its own kind of racial skewing and peculiarities. In a way, South Africa affords us a kind of laboratory conditions for studying what happens when social networks are first constrained enormously to the extent that it determined where you were born, which hospital segregated, where you lived, which school you went to, all segregated, what kind of work you did, not in many cases where you worked, but not always. And it did constrain the kind of relations between employer and employee as well. And finally, it followed you to the grave, the segregated cemetery. Now, all of that went overboard when Nelson Mandela was released and the ANC came into power in 1994. And then we've had a complete opening up of society. Most importantly is the opening up of education. So people were then free to choose a school they wanted to go to, with some provisos. One is that the best schools are private schools, and the second best schools, called Model C schools, the details needn't bother us, but they were formally white, not private, but close to private school quality, were then opened to people of all races, provided they could afford the fees. And the fees at some of these private schools are enormous. In fact, some of the private schools near my university charge more in fees for the year than our university does. So in theory, there was some opening up. And in fact, there have been major shifts. It's only the poorest of the poor who are stuck in their neighborhood schools. Otherwise, it's been a kind of musical chairs. And there was a kind of racial hierarchy in apartheid South Africa, whites at the top, black people at the bottom, colored sort of not close, but second, and Indians somewhere around third. And the kind of musical chairs determined that if you could afford to travel out of your neighborhood, then people then at least went one layer up in their education to the extent that was possible. My story then is about the children who have studied as a first generation of children at non-racial schools, involved in non-racial peer groups, studying at the best schools, namely private schools and what we call Model C in South Africa. And here, initially, whites were in a majority and still are in the private schools, less so in the Model C schools. The Model C schools, depending on neighborhood, because there has been a flight of the elites from some neighborhoods, as you might expect from history elsewhere. In some Model C schools, again, whites are in a majority, although in some, whites are not to be found at all, whereas it was formerly reserved for them. And it's become largely black, where black can also mean including African and colored. I'll come to the term colored shortly because that's a complex issue that has to be factored in. Okay, now given that these children who went to these schools were from the middle classes, and despite itself there was a black middle class, although very small in apartheid South Africa. The whole idea of apartheid South Africa was to constrain the social movements of black people, fit them with enough rudiments of education to succeed in labor situations and nothing else. Nevertheless, some professionals like a few doctors, a few lawyers, and so forth, and some business people, did succeed and become enormously rich, but were stifled by apartheid in that they couldn't move out of a black area and couldn't invest and couldn't send their children to the best schools, etc. That started to crumble even before apartheid officially ended. So come 1994, already there was a small segment of the black population and of Indians and coloreds who were materially somewhat better off than black people to enter those private schools. However, with whites being in a majority of those schools, they became the reference group. So for my study, the kind of reference group in terms of social status, prestige, friendship as well, because this is a success story. The hundreds of interviews we've been doing in Cape Town show that at schools, especially primary schools, there were no serious problems across racial groups, certainly not in the private schools. In some Model C schools, it was mostly fine, except the boys of different racial groups occasionally would beat each other up, they said quite easily, and apparently that is the norm, as boys will be boys, etc. Now, 10 years down the line, people suddenly woke up to the enormous change that had happened and what I call a silent linguistic revolution. Inadvertently, those parents who had sent their children to the best schools were dismayed to find that their children had changed completely after 10 years in terms of behavior, posture, gesture, culture, attitude to a whole lot of things held dear in conservative traditional societies like gender relations, marriage, and so on, customary practices, rituals, and so on. So to the extent that politicians, you would think would have much better things to do and more important things to do, had debates and brought out a report expressing their grave concern about the way young people had changed and were, quote unquote, losing their culture. Often allied to this concern of losing culture is the fear expressed of children losing their language. Now, when you deal with South Africa, you must recognize that English is the home language of a very small segment of the country, perhaps 15%, but growing. Okay, so African languages are alive and well, and much more so with the working classes and lower middle classes, but there are now, for the first time, some black families who have moved into the former white suburbs and who are outnumbered there, but also whose education and lifestyles are changing and who are starting to speak less and less of their traditional languages like Zulu or Xhosa, etc. And politicians have particularly picked on women to say, look at these young women, they stand out there chatting loudly, cigarette in hand, as if this is the epitome of status. And it goes hand in hand with learning English and the kind of English they are speaking. Okay? So there's a huge generation gap in South Africa with the middle classes. And however, there is a lessening of the gender divide of former times. So for me, this is a fascinating issue, and I think you can't have it both ways. You can't have the best of education, the best of salaries. There's a huge affirmative economic program in action in South Africa, which I largely support, although there are some question marks about some aspects. But it shows the difficulty of choosing a kind of Western, late, advanced capital lifestyle and nevertheless expecting people's identities and beliefs and so on not to change. And so maybe in terms of the agendas of English, that is an interesting issue to be looking at. Okay, now for academic linguistic purposes, I mean, this is a wide open field, really. You can look at things from the perspective of language content and bilingualism, variation, speech accommodation, social networks, because once the social networks were highly constrained racially, and they're now changed, and we can then see the effects on language. And I would say, I would submit vice versa, the effect to which language can effect change. I would say that with the young women, language, use of English, and a particular high status accent are agents of social change. So it's not purely a situation of language reflecting what's going on in the wider world. Then I want to talk about crossing and crossovers. You all know that crossing was Ben Rampton's term for the playful, almost flirtatious use of a language by a dominant group of youngsters starting to use a language they were not expected to know and didn't know very well. And so crossing is a way of young people playing with ethnic boundaries, playing with language, and really contesting some of the established mores of the previous generation. Crossing in the old South Africa was not possible. It would purely be lampoon and parody. And even in the new South Africa, crossing, I did not find much evidence of crossing in the first 10 years, because I think race relations were still far too sensitive an issue to be experimenting playfully with and with using in a slightly mocking way. Instead, what I'm going to record are crossovers. So the young people I'm going to be looking at are not crossing into a variety. They have moved into it, have adopted it, have appropriated it, if you like. And so I talk of crossover lifestyles and accents, which is what's going on. Okay, a part of this is the phenomenon called coconut in South Africa. Now, for those of you at Drakensberg last year, rest assured I won't go into the details. There I talked for at length, about 15 minutes, on this wonderful novel written by a young medical student at my university, Kopana Matlwa, who still speaks Tswana. And it's a wonderful novel about identity change, a young person brought up in the kind of situation I was describing to you, who has lost the ability to speak Tswana and whose friendship circles was entirely white and who saw the world as white, and didn't know this until it was pointed out to her by her brother that all the pictures of the pop stars and film stars were entirely white on a wall, and her friends were all white, and she spoke and behaved white. And she then tries to resurrect something of her traditional background. She tries to learn Tswana. She thinks she succeeds, but it seems to me as a linguist she's failed because she learns lists of words and nothing else. Coconut is a term that encapsulates what's going on in South Africa and the kind of different positions regarding identity change and so forth. Coconuts are people who do not behave in the way traditionally expected of them. Quote unquote, these are people who are dark on the outside, white on the inside. Okay? And this term is very well known in middle class South Africa. It's hardly known in working class societies that I worked with. When I ask someone, you know, what's a coconut? One of many questions one asks, and they say, oh, it's an edible fruit, isn't it? And then you know other meaning. And this tells you something about the class chasm. So what I'm saying is not typical of the country. It's one segment and one thing that I think is both interesting and promising that's going on. But it's true to say that people in the townships, the large majority of poor, disadvantaged, and unemployed and underemployed people don't share the kind of concerns about identity and fashion and status and so on. And being a coconut is a complex thing. Usually people see others as coconuts. So we've had students on campus who report this, that they saw these very fancy black youngsters, and black can also mean Indian and colored, from private schools who speak and behave totally differently from what their prototype of a black person was, and they call them coconuts. But after studying for the year at university, these very same students who do the labeling go back home to their traditional areas, and hey presto, they've changed subtly without realizing it, and all their former friends in the villages, rural areas, and even townships label them coconuts. So it's a very interesting phenomenon. The only people who don't object to coconut and who laugh about it and who think it's a bit of a lark are not just the new middle classes, but I would submit the solidly upper middle class. And I would say those who are insecure about the label and take major objection to being labeled a coconut would, in my terms, correlate with being lower middle class. And the upper middle class are above it all. They just see it as just another term out there. And they probably recognize that their behavior has gone way beyond reacting to reproaches. Coconut, and this is the last joke that I'll repeat from Regensburg, coconut is a term that I've been accused just once or twice to say, why are you using these derogatory terms, and shouldn't you know better, and so on. I said, well, we'd rather discuss things openly than sort of suppress things. We've had enough of suppression and banning of terms and things. More so, it's not the sociolinguists who've invented the term. Young people are the ones who've come up with the term. And it does mean something. It's equivalent of the Oreo biscuit in the United States, etc. And most of people are using this as a way of actually coming to terms with former disparities and what physiological and physical differences really mean and what should they mean, etc. And the young people I've interviewed in their home settings, not in a kind of formal situation, really have fun with terms like this. And there are a number of terms out there. Oreo is also starting to be known in South Africa. Banana is one terrible term that I've heard, and I've seen it on a website in Britain as well for Chinese community. Yellow on the outside, etc. And this can continue. But in South Africa, kids are playing with terms like this. And I came across the term for white people, coined by Indians and coloreds, a lychee. And I said, well, I don't see what this has to do with it. I said, lychee, easy, white on the outside, dark on the inside for their best friends, who are quite happy to be friends with black people. White on the outside, dark on the inside, turns red in the sun. Okay. Just two preliminaries before I get on with my analysis. Firstly, to look at older black South African English, I'll use SAE for South African English and B for black, I for Indian, etc. It must be recognized that older black South African English, which as I now call it because it's almost being superseded by changes in the younger generation, got by, and this is hard to believe, but you have to hear it to believe it, got by largely with 5 basic vowels, no schwa, and 1 or 2 diphthongs. And in the most basilectal speakers, even the diphthongs will be redistributed into 2 syllables as monophthongs with glides in between, okay? So there are mergers there. There's EU, EO, and A. There's some allophonic variation with nasals for the mid-vowels, and there's some speaker variation. The last time I gave a talk like this, someone said, but trap isn't here. Trap in South Africa is there. It's more like trap. Well, that's not entirely true. There is speaker variation, and for various reasons, I think phonologically it's down here and it sort of raises in very special conditions. We just want to keep this in mind to chart out just how significant the changes have been of the kind that I'm going to talk about. So since my topic is the goose vowel, goose then would be not lengthened, it would be neutralized, and it would simply be goose. Okay, that's the older black South African pronunciation, goose. You would hear goose, but only in phonologically constrained settings, i.e. second last syllable, goosely or something like that. So this really does work with the most basilectal speakers. But as people get more mesolectal, more acquaintance with English, etc., it starts to change, and you can chart that out, and it could be quite fascinating. The last preamble is the notion of colored. I don't think this is very clear. Sorry, this was a last-minute appropriation. I pulled off an old newspaper from the kitchen and just scanned it in. Colored in South Africa means not black in the South African sense, not white in the South African sense, but belonging to a different ethnic category. People identify with colored, although the middle classes disavow it strongly, but the majority call themselves brown people in Afrikaans, bruin mense, or colored in English. And these are people with multiple ancestries. These ancestries could be people of Khoisan origin, and Khoisan is the most indigenous people of South Africa. Okay, that's another story. We're not going there historically. Another strand, this is another strand of the colored community, the kind of sports and games they play. And out here are people, I'm sorry, you probably can't see that clearly. You might think they look black if you have perceptions and prototypes about what's black, but these would be colored kids playing in the colored league close by to my home. And for those of you who follow soccer, a dialectologist visiting me last week was astounded when I was trying to explain these things to him. What is colored, what is black? And he then started playing this game, identifying people as to whether they're colored or black, and he got it wrong 90% of the time. And the footballer Benny McCarthy, if you know your football, apologies if you don't, is not black but colored. Now what makes him not black is that he doesn't speak an African language. What makes him colored is he grew up in a colored community. He clearly has an ancestor who's a Bantu speaking black, but colored is precisely this forward-looking community which absorbs people from different ancestries, including Malay slaves. So there's an Islamic strand there, and ironically in Africa, when they needed slaves in the 17th and 18th century, they stocked up slaves from the East, from India, Malaysia, and such. And so another strand would sort of look Eastern and Oriental and Malaysian and even Indian. Okay, so it's a complex term. And so colored, if you like, merges with white at one level, with the middle classes who have white ancestry that they look up to. It could merge with black more at the working class level of black people who in the old apartheid days wouldn't get jobs if they were black, but would have got jobs if they're colored. So hey presto, they tried to classify themselves and pass as colored, and therefore it means learning Afrikaans and pretending not to know your ethnic language. At another level, colored could include, as I said, a lot of Eastern people, largely Malay, but also some Indians by intermarriage, and some original Indian slaves from the 17th century, which is not well recognized in South African history. Okay, so those will be the 4 groups that I'm going to be talking about. A quick resume. Last year, I kind of optimistically looked at word list style of goose, So it's only the pronunciation of the word goose, and I reported on females. And this here is a chart of, this is a vowel chart. In a way, I'm talking to myself because I've learned sociophonetics late, relatively late. This is a chart with F1, the sort of first formant on this axis, and F2 in reverse, starting with low values out here, going this way. And this corresponds reasonably well to the vowel chart, and it can show up systematicities that you wouldn't guess from doing purely auditory phonetics. Here, the numbers don't represent formants. If they were formants, we'd be looking at roughly 300 here and 3,000 here and 300 here and about 1,200 here. We've had to normalize these so that you can't compare scores of F1 versus F2 for the vowels of the words you're studying across speakers without first normalizing for vocal tract differences in vocal tract configuration. And for males and females, this could be quite big. So there are many programs available these days that help you normalize, and it's essentially by taking the extreme points of an individual speaker's vowel space, highest vowels, frontest, backest, and lowest, and doing a normalization there by averaging them and then dividing each vowel by that center point. So you create a center point by taking the average of this vowel, and this one here. So you get a center point and then you divide everything else, and I can't vouch for the science of this, but I trust Dominic Watt, Jerry Doherty, Paul Fuchs, who are my experts on this issue that I turn to occasionally. And this more or less gives us a viable vowel chart. And in fact, Lebov's phonological atlas operates on this principle. And I didn't specify last year that the midpoint is in fact on this scale 1.2. I'll modify this shortly with a new scale that I'll come to. And there is a website called Norm, which actually, if you key in all your formant values, will then give you a choice of 5 different formulae to choose to normalize, and you take your pick. And I'm going for the British school of what is now starting to be called the Watts-Fabricius method. Okay, what I want to say is that these are reliable. These are just 7 female speakers, white South Africans, all fronted. This is what we saw last year, story so far, only in wordless style. And in fact, this is the word goose. South African Indian English, which has historically, partly based on English of India, but partly of English of South Africa, ironically is a bit closer to RP in some of its vowels, but not its consonants, is more RP-like insofar as its goose vowel is relatively back. This is wordless style for 7 females. All of these are from the background I've charted out, non-racial schooling, irrespective of where they currently live. Then the colored colored females are all over the place. We saw one out here, which I'm going to discard. In fact, my current research shows this was just a one-off thing, but there kind of is a bigger spread there, some front of center, others back of center. And the black females are taken, this is a midpoint, slightly back, but not very much, but also considerably in front. So let me then just play you what these sound like, and apologies because I don't have a sort of speech lab or anything. This is all sort of in the office and in people's homes kind of recordings, and let's hope this plays. I'm a bit worried about the interface between my laptop and the rest, but here goes. This is a back goose of speaker 4.
Goose.
I'll play it again.
Goose.
Okay, that's quite back. This is sort of more center, but backish.
Goose, goose, goose.
And this is front, and I hope it plays because sometimes I have problems with this one.
Goose, goose, goose.
Okay, so those are the reference points. This one would come
Goose.
back,
Goose, goose,
back, sort of central,
goose, goose.
and front.
Goose, goose.
Okay. Now, That, I'm afraid, is the story so far. Now I'm going to take a quick tour of work in progress, as Bent had promised you. How much time do I have left? Have you thought about that? Sorry? 20. Wow, what a man. Okay, I thought I had 10, all right? Sorry, did I say man? I said, what a person, sorry. Okay, now the news story begins here because I've said, look, I only looked at females, I looked at word list style, so it's now time to do the serious work, okay? And sociophonetics, I've discovered, is not for the faint-hearted. If you want a piece of advice, folks, start young or stick to contact linguistics, all right? It's fairly rigorous, thanks to one William Labov, in whose footsteps I do follow. I mean, I recognize the most frustrating thing about doing work in my neck of the woods, far away from anywhere, is that Labov's done it all before, okay? And I start off from the bottom up. I start off trying to understand the problem. I'm less interested in what the theoreticians are saying in the West. But for this particular issue, the story is the story of middle class formation, status, social change, class, and gender. Okay, so now I went through, I now factored in male speakers. So instead of 28 speakers that I discussed in Regensburg, I now have 48 speakers, and these are both genders, if you'll allow the duality there, or let's just say more than one gender. And I look at all style, not just wordless style, which is easy because you just look at one token, but now you look at every token for goose, okay, in your casual style, in your interviews. And I just thought I'd give you a quick count, which were the most frequent words. This is a sample of quarter of my tokens. School is the most common one because we asked a lot about school, all right? So we've got lots of tokens of school, 192. Next most common word is do, 108. Probably do overtakes school, except we couldn't count all of them. If it's unstressed, you just discard it. So doing sociophonetics means making practical decisions. There are certain vowels you're never going to get reliable form and scores for if they assimilated and fast and so on. And so you go for what you have. You usually go for full forms. South Africa, the word Zulu surprisingly is up third and gives us 2 tokens. I counted both Zu and Lu. Some people might have said just go for the one main syllable, but this is pronounced in traditional Zulu, as back as you can get, and so on, although the young people are changing it and making life complicated. Then there's to, move, cool, group, to, who, and when I say who, I also mean whose, and who'd, WHO, apostrophe D, and things like that, and through, and throughout. Those are the common 10. And I couldn't resist giving you the one that's the bottom of the list is the word goose itself. No one had occasion to talk about a goose in any of our interviews, okay? Right, now let's get to the real analysis. And this is where sociolinguistics have to get real. And if I were to tell you, well, these are what my graph looks like. And here there are different shadings, and please don't panic and leave the room, etc. We're going to discard all the tough stuff and move fairly briskly to the easier stuff, or what illuminates the difficulty here. Okay, different colors for whether it's word list or casual style, different colors for ethnicity, and for gender, 2. Then you may say, well, if there were 192 tokens, why so few here? If you're looking at all your tokens, well, this is now the average per speaker for casual style of the goose vowel. So we're looking at each kind of dot or point represents the average of the speaker and could come from anything from about 30 tokens to about 100 tokens, okay? With school, by the way, we stopped counting after 25. That was way too much. In fact, already I may have to even revise that. But after 25 tokens, we stopped counting school. So the good news is that there's an amazing spread, and there's got to be a sociolinguistic story to tell, okay? And the bad news is that sociolinguistics is in fact messy, all right? The kind of idealized stories we present in textbooks, etc., are just that. Still, I submit that there are patterns here and that warrant further investigation. So let's tease out style first. I mean, this is just crazy to put in word list after all 1 token of goose with hundreds of other tokens. So if we just look at the word list style, with the word list style, goose. So this is, if you like, take two from Regensburg. This is now factoring in the colored community and factoring in males. But again, and there are patterns here, but again, I think there are easier ways of teasing them out. So I'm just going to say, you know, yellow circles sort of out here, also yellow diamonds out here, blue circles out here. Those are the main patterns. Blue squares all over, red triangles with apart from this one goes out here. Now, by the way, you've noticed that I've changed this back to formants because since Regensburg, I discovered that your website gives you the option of either using those units or other things called Bach units, let's not worry about those, or back to good old formants. So these are normalized formants, and taking my cue from Lebov, I would say that the midpoint is 1550. I actually took 1500 when doing my first pass at the data. I sort of worked on the mathematics and said 1500 has got to be the midpoint. But in fact, I've seen Lebov's phonological atlas. He says 1550 is his midpoint. So everything up here is back of center. This is back, this is front, and this is front of center. Okay. So we're going to try and tease this further. But before I do that, just to show you, we have 48 graphs of all tokens. So this is a graph of all the tokens. Not going to do anything in terms of analysis just yet, but just to show you what we did was break things up into environment, because that's going to help us as well. So for the environments, we have, oh, by the way, this star here is the word list, goose itself, and everything else will be other tokens. Yellow triangles here are what I call J words, and J means the European J, as in fjords, yod in other words. Because initially I didn't want to work with yod. I said it's going to front it for everyone. There's not a story to be told. I can leave it out. But then I realized one day at 7 in the morning when I arrived on campus and I saw one white female greeting another white male, and she said, "How are ye?" And I said, gosh, no one's as front as that. Okay, so, you know, that's the umlaut of all umlauts. And so I went back and said to my assistant, sorry, but we've got to factor in the J words too. So J words in yellow, and in purple here are words with backing environments. Lebov calls them, and I again did this, consulted Lebov after doing my analysis. These would be the non-coronals. For me, these would be environments with K, with R, with H, and with L, and with many words like school. You've got a preceding K and a following L, and you can have fun deciding what's what. So I pulled out what I call the backing environments, and I did that by an inspection of the data, and from the other environments which are neutral. So the fronting environments are yellow, that's the palatals, J words. Pink or purple, whatever it is, would be backing environments, including the word school. So when it's a purple with a blue around it, it means it's a backing environment, and in particular, it's the word school. And green is everything else, i.e. fronting environments. Lebov for North America says these are coronals, T, D, S, N, sin, T, TWO2, D, and so on. But it might be a bit wider in South Africa. So that's the basis of an analysis that's going to offer us sort of some patterns amongst the difficulties I've already pointed to. And these are more speakers, it doesn't really matter. The first thing then that I looked at is whether goose in word list style, so I'm building a sociolinguistic story here, in word list style, where does the word goose itself fit in relation to that midpoint of 1550 or 1500. For the white community, it is always fronter of central in word list style, so it's always goose or geese, depends, but it's front. With the black community studied, it's mixed. 4 female versus 3 give you a front token, and male is 2 versus 2. Colored community, mixed again, but rather more in the direction of not fronted. And with Indians, it's complex. Last year in Regensburg, I confidently said that Indians are not fronting because they have a safe dialect. I mean, some of this analysis has to take into account what went on previously, and am I actually analyzing 4 separate dialects and merging them erroneously into one? I submit that that is what would happen if I were working with working class varieties. They are so different that you can't chart them together. Trying to chart out a black South African, older black South African 5-vowel system with a white system simply won't work, okay? But remember I said this is in fact one community. I'm labeling them white, black, colored, and Indian purely for analytic reasons. They needn't see themselves as that. Some of them do, but it depends on circumstance, whether you are Indian in one circumstances, or you're young in another, or female in another, or cool in another, or cool as they say, and so on and so on. So I'm not sort of saying that ethnicity is stable at all, but I'm just talking about analytic categories to understand change. And the story, the brief story that I want to paint here is that whereas colored and Indian communities had a wide range of English lex in the past, to the extent that they had acrolex of their own, which carry prestige not just in the community, but more so in public circumstances. So the acrolect will get you by, it marks you as educated but community, but also educated and belonging to the wider world and capable of using that lect in a wider meeting, etc. And I submit that for young black people, there was no such reference acrolect. This might be controversial, and I'm sure I'd be questioned back home, but I'm saying that older black South African English lacked an acrolect. After all, people spoke an African language or 7 fluently, and knowledge of English was restricted deliberately, okay, and many industries worked on Afrikaans rather than English. So English was restricted and education was restricted, so there wasn't a reference acrolect for young people to peg their codes of identity onto. And so I'm saying that they had little choice but to fashion something new. But it seems to me the story is that they didn't fashion something new, but they more or less adopted the white variants from the earliest days of the private schools of the 1990s. So that's where I'm heading. Another way I could look at the Goose word list tokens is comparing Goose word lists with the casual style for the backing environments, the sort of purple and blue ones. And again, the same pattern, whites, the kind of reference group always front in relation to words like school for them is relatively backish, even for white speakers. But Goose in word list style is always fronted. With the black speakers, the pattern for females is rather like that of whites, but for males it's diverse, a bit of it. For coloreds, it's the opposite. There's more investment in not fronting. And for Indians, it's kind of muted. So for the story for the casual style of Indians, I'm modifying. My first pass at the data in Rekensberg proves to be not quite true for young Indian speakers. So let's look at that. In terms of environments, this is where the white community is. Red for backing environments, although my computer seems to have omitted school this time, or forgot to note which ones are school. Yellow is the fronting or J environments, and blue are other environments, mostly coronals. Black South African English, on average, treats these frontings as front and the back as front. So if you look at the white and the black, it's hard to say, are these patterns similar or not? We'll just note them for the time being. But we'll note that for the Indian community, it's quite different, that there's investment more on this side. And for the colored community, there seems to be more of a spread. Okay, we're getting closer to refining a kind of picture. And let's look at this more clearly. So I went through the past stuff fast because I don't think you can see the pattern that clearly there. But now I think you can. This time it's casual style, all the Goose tokens in the interview, in other words, by ethnicity. And this is what we see. We'll always see what the stats have suggested so far, although that was more for word list, that for casual style, it's true that the whites in yellow are relatively homogeneous. I wasn't expecting this. If you listen to white accents on campus, they can be quite varied, but the ones of the background I chose are fairly homogeneous for both male and female. I mean, that's a quite close circle there. I didn't expect, or did I? I'm not sure, but the black students, well, I knew for the females, I thought were indeed mimicking the whites, okay? And I don't mean, maybe that's not the best way of putting it, but certainly they are adopting white variants here and are quite close, except for these two, and surprise, these two are males, okay? And here's one hidden here. And I'm one male short with the black community. Actually, I have 47 speakers, not 48, because there was a slight mess up somewhere. So this is still has to be teased out a little bit. So this is what I'm saying. Largely, the black community is out here with the white community, surprising to some extent in that it incorporates males. Blue dots, squares for Indians, and the Indians are this time spread in the casual style. And the casual style is far more reliable. It's got lots of tokens, whereas the word list was really once off, and it's really people being slightly careful and choosing how they say a particular variant, and I might have something to say there. So here it seems to me that some young Indians are keen not to sound white, if I may put it that way, in casual style. These are the ones back of center. There are others, however, who don't have those feelings, and depending on relationships, I think, and social networks, and I think family values and backgrounds and things like that, which will have to be factored in, hopefully with more speakers to prove that point, some indeed are matching with the yellows or the white reference community. With the coloreds, mostly no. I mean, it's noticeable that the red triangles for coloreds are clustered out here, one exception which we can live with and out there. And I'm quite happy to have exceptions in my data because it shows we are dealing with human beings with different histories. In fact, it's not very easy to come up with social generalizations for all of this group because some people started off in an ethnic school for a year or two, then went to a private school and then reverted to a Model C school. Others started with a Model C school, went to private school. So we're not going to get pure backgrounds of informants. So I'm not fazed by exceptions. So now we're getting close to the end. Teasing this out further by ethnicity, I think, does give us a picture. It clarifies the ethnic picture I've been painting so far. And that is, again, let's start with a reference group of the yellow dots for white females. This is goose in casual style. So this is all casual style, lots of tokens. These are the averages. These are the females, okay? And again, all but one of the black females in green are more or less matching there. Slightly higher perhaps, but are more or less there. Almost none of the red colored females are out here, with the one exception here, but even this is in fact backish. If you take 1550 as our midpoint, even this is backish, but this falls within the range of the white reference group. Okay, so there's a story to be told about the clustering of red circles there and the spread of blue circles and the clustering of green circles on this side. Let's compare the females with the males. Males, fewer tokens because I had 28 females and in theory 20 males, turned out to be 19. That pattern is a little more diffuse. Again, the male reference group is out here for whites, and I'm again draw attention to white males and females being surprisingly homogeneous over goose. The black males this time, and I'm not surprised, are in different places. Okay, I can't stand on this generalization, too few speakers really, but I'm not surprised that one is up there accommodating, one is kind of back of center, and one is on his own. And I submit, in fact, this is a hypothesis of my project, that women are in the advance of change, of social change in South Africa. It's the women who are doing the most deracialization, making the most cross-racial friendships. Men are holding back somewhat. It's harder to be a male and to be speaking in this fancy upper middle class white way than it is for black females. That's where I'm heading. Indians, it depends. Some are holding back, others indeed, and I suspect it's to do with the home setup, where you live, and the nature of friendships, etc. I guess the intensity of the social networks and all of that stuff would account for things better. So I'm saying here there is a range. You can't make one generalization, it's more like two generalizations. And the colored community, you can see, is certainly holding back in terms of males. There should be 5 circles here. I think this one here has 2 circles, one underneath the other. Okay, now I conclude by looking at the school, but really I think this will be an overload of information. Because school was such a rich token in the data, I just ran an analysis of only the word school in a way that was nice, just to see what's going on. And surprisingly, this is not treated the same way by different speakers. Whites tend to treat it as a backing environment, school. They don't, school is very unusual. Surprisingly, the white females, the black females do give us fronter variants on average of school, to bringing it to school, all right? And with the Indians, again, we have some hanging back and 2 almost hypercorrecting here to school. So maybe there's a story of hypercorrection of some Indians and many blacks, but not with coloreds, compared to the reference dialect. Okay. And with males, this is the last slide really, the last serious slide. With males, there is no such hypercorrection, if I may term it that. That is roughly, there is matching. If this is my reference group, the yellow dots, then the blue dots of Indian males are roughly matching it, slightly behind and slightly lower. And the green dots of black speakers are holding back, and the coloreds, with one exception, are holding back. So I'm saying that if we can call this kind of thing structural hypercorrection, and hypercorrection is really in learner varieties, and by learner varieties would even mean learning a new second dialect of a first language, would mean overgeneralization of a rule, okay? And so it counts as a kind of structural hypercorrection, not hypercorrection the way Lebov first defined it. So that's a possibility, but I would like to have many more speakers before rushing to that generalization. So my conclusions: the data shows new class formation and identity in language. Black females match the white South African English profile the most. Black males also match to some extent. They're participating in change, but to a lesser extent. The colored group shows less participation, in fact the least, and both genders are kind of uniform here. The Indian group is variable. Some participate more in the change than others who are holding back to a kind of older reference acrolect. Thanks to my graduate students. This is University of Cape Town, graduate students, Oscar Massiniana, and thanks to the NRF, and to you.